Okay, Member for Morialta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Member. Page 27 of Budget Paper 5, the Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care, $2 million. When will the government deliver on its election commitment for this Early Childhood Royal Commission?
Thanks, Member for Morialta. Do you mean in terms of the commencement or completion, or was there...
I think you can assume that the list of questions I have here includes commencement, completion, appointment, announcement of terms of reference. Provide as much answer as you like in your first answer, and we'll get to the rest in subsequent questions.
Very happy to do that. I thank the Member for Morialta for his guidance. So if I could perhaps provide a bit of context about what is obviously a very considerable election commitment that was first made right back on, I think, October the 21st last year by the now Premier, now Deputy Premier and myself, about what we are doing to ensure the support we are providing in the first 1,000 days to our young people in terms of their brain and social development, and the significance of those first 1,000 days in terms of that, how much of that development occurs in that period. The alarming stats here, I guess, which drive a lot of the investment that governments around the world are making into the early years, is that nearly 25% of South Australian 5-year-olds, and the figures are similar indeed for other jurisdictions, start school behind on their developmental milestones. This was the genesis, I guess it's fair to say, in terms of moving to a system of universal preschool for 3-year-olds, which was the election commitment to which the Member for Morialta refers. We committed to a comprehensive inquiry into what can be done to better support families to make South Australia the best place to be born and to grow up. And the Royal Commission, in light of that, will examine services and support provided to families in the crucial first 1,000 days of a child's life, how to best implement the government's commitment to 3-year-old preschool, and how all families can have access to out-of-school hours care that works for them. The recent announcements, which no doubt members of this place will be aware of, by the New South Wales and Victorian governments, are significant investments in the future of their children. The Royal Commission will examine what works best in the South Australian context, noting that there are differences in how we provide, or who provides the preschool for 4-year-olds here currently. The Royal Commission is really just the first step, I guess, in transforming the early years system in South Australia. We need expert advice in regards to what that best investment is for our children. Workforce capacity, as I've said before, will be an important consideration for the Royal Commission. We need to make sure we not only keep our skilled and dedicated early childhood educators here, but that we develop the workforce we need to transform our early years system. I think the time is obviously right, given the announcements by I think we've had so far Victoria commit to the rollout of 3-year-old preschool, the ACT as well. New South Wales seem to be heading in that direction, but made announcements of pretty significant import in the last week in terms of what they are going to do. In terms of the Royal Commission specifically, the government has allocated $2 million to that Royal Commission. We want it to start as quickly as we can. I am hopeful that the Premier and I will be able to make an announcement soon about who the Royal Commissioner will be. That will obviously be a public announcement. We will then straight away sit down with whoever that person is to discuss with them the scope of the Royal Commission that I outlined just before, and make sure we get their advice on whether there is anything else that needs to be considered in there. And of course, in terms of when it will finish, given that I've said it will start as soon as possible, and I think that will be soon, I think what we have said publicly, and my departmental people will correct me if I'm wrong, was we initially said 12 to 20 months. I don't envisage us extending that timeline, and although no decision has been made, if anything, I would envisage us potentially shortening that timeline, if anything, to make sure that we have the advice in time to deliver on the commitment that we've made about commencement in 2026. I might leave that there and let the member ask another question.
Thank you. Has the Royal Commissioner been selected at this stage?
No.
How will the Royal Commissioner be selected, and what sort of person is the government seeking to undertake this work?
obviously we would like to have someone with some knowledge of the area. I think that's important. I'm not necessarily saying it needs to be what you would describe as an expert in the field, but given, and I'm sure this is something that I grappled with and only probably properly understood it upon having kids of my own and being part of the early years as a parent. It is a complex area, and it's made more complex by the fact that not all states do it the same way in terms of who offers it. It's not always funded in the same way either. So with that in mind, some level of knowledge of the existing system is important. Of course, we want someone, though, who can, I guess, in terms of the really important consultation work that needs to happen with the sector and stakeholders, make sure that it is someone who knows how to have that kind of engagement, someone who is respected by those sectors, someone, I guess, who is good at making sure all the stakeholders get an appropriate say on how they feel this should be done, supporting them through that, but also providing a very clear roadmap to exactly how we meet our commitment for commencement in 2026. So I know that's a kind of broad answer, and as I said, I'm pretty confident that we will have an announcement about who the person will be soon. The process will be the same as it has been for the appointment of Royal Commissioners in the past. I believe it is recommendation from Cabinet to the Governor, and then assuming the Governor signs off, then things can get underway. Support will be provided, I think, through the Attorney-General's Department, along with some support, of course, from the Education Department as well. Was there anything maybe? No? I think I'll leave my answer there.
So thank you for that. In relation to the support that the Minister just identified, he said there was support from the Attorney-General's Department and support from the Education Department. Are you talking about in-kind support, staff support, in addition to this $2 million expenditure that's outlined on page 27?
So in terms of the Attorney-General's Department, that is the $2 million that we have set out. In terms of the Department for Education's contribution, as you said, that will be largely in-kind. Ms Bray points out that there'll be a fair bit of work in terms of making sure that the documentation that the Royal Commissioner needs to consider is the right documentation, is current and is accurate once it's passed over for the Commissioner to do their work.
Yeah, I understand it's not unusual for a Royal Commission that wants to seek information from government departments that there's a certain cost for those departments in ensuring that all the provision of information is accurate. Certainly the Education Department, its interactions with the Disability Royal Commission nationally in recent years, that has taken up significant staff resources. Is there any budget within the Education Department's budget for what the anticipated cost to the Education Department of supporting this Royal Commission is going to be, in addition to the $2 million in the budget papers?
I might pass over to Professor Westwood to speak, but there haven't been any discussions around that with me. My understanding is that the cost, I think, will be absorbed by the department, but I'll let Professor Westwood talk a bit more about what that support might look like and whether there's any cost.
Yeah. So we've had those discussions internally about what that might look like, and we're confident that we can absorb that within the current resources of the department. We want to really see the detail and the direction that the Royal Commission takes, but we think we can absorb that within the department.
Thank you. In relation to the $2 million identified on page 27, how much of that is budgeted to go towards the salary or the pay required by the Royal Commissioner?
So from the outset, I guess the $2 million is the figure that we have set aside, and operating within that envelope, I think it will depend potentially on who the candidate is, but we don't envisage that the pressures from what the payment to the Royal Commissioner would need to be will put any, I guess, upwards pressure on the $2 million envelope. I think my own experience, not pleasant ones in dealing with Royal Commissions in the past, and the Royal Commission is that the rates that the Royal Commissioner, I think, has set out in some cases for what their fee would be has in some cases been different depending on whether the person in the past has been a former judge or something like that. Not necessarily anticipating that's going to be the case here, but that's a conversation that we'll need to have with the successful candidate, but don't expect that will push us outside our envelope.
And will that figure be made publicly in due course?
That on notice. My honest answer to you, Member for Morialta, is I don't know what the procedure for that is, but I shall seek an answer.
In relation to the $2 million, is that new money to the Education Department, new money to the budget, or is that from within Education Department existing resources repurposed for this election commitment?
I understand it's new money. Hard-fought new money. Hard-fought and won, in this case.
You win some and you lose some.
You sure do. You sure do.
In relation to the Royal Commission, when will the government release the terms of reference for the Royal Commission?
So we've obviously set out what we referred to, I think, as a draft terms of reference, which we put out before the state election and have issued and spoken about since. And we don't anticipate much variation in that, but I think it would be the prudent thing for us to do once the Royal Commissioner has been in place and signed off or approved by the Governor, that we sit down with that person and talk to them about whether or not they're comfortable, whether or not they think there's anything we need to add, or but I don't anticipate any great change to the terms of reference. But once we've had that conversation with whoever the Royal Commissioner is, we will obviously make the final terms of reference public.
Given the, some would argue, the narrow scope of the initial terms of reference for Royal Commission, and I'm talking about in relation to delivering on an outcome already identified by the Labor opposition, as it was to have the universal 3-year-old preschool and how to do it. And I think the Labor Party subsequently made a couple of additions to what the Royal Commission would examine. And given the Minister's indicated the Royal Commissioner's advice will also be sought as to whether they would like to amend the scope, will the Minister consider consulting with relevant stakeholders in the early childhood space, preschool and long daycare service providers, Early Childhood Australia and other stakeholders in relation to any suggestions they might have for gaining maximum benefit from this Royal Commission?
That's an excellent question, and one of the very first things that we grappled with in opposition when we were formulating this policy was that, you know, it would most likely be of at least some concern to the long daycare and childcare sectors, because what we envisage is that 3-year-olds, once it's up and running, will be doing preschool at least for some period during the week. Obviously, our goal is to have the same amount available to 3-year-olds as we do to 4-year-olds, but that would be taking them away in some instances from childcare. So we engaged, from memory, I think it might be Kerry Marnie from... Yes, Kerry Marnie from the Australian Childcare Alliance, and sat down and talked through what our intention was in terms of making sure they're engaged in part of the Royal Commission. I think we came to a good understanding there that our intention here is not to try to in some way sabotage their business model or anything like that, and they too acknowledge, I think, which is very decent of them, that this is a global shift towards preschool for 3-year-olds, and that it's coming one way or the other. And so we gave them a commitment to make sure they would be part of the Royal Commission and have opportunities to, if they so feel, express ways that they could be part of the delivery of it, if it was in some way necessary. They were comfortable with that, and now that I am the Minister, I reaffirm my commitment to work with all those parties, acknowledging the very important services that they offer, and that the move to 3-year-old preschool shouldn't be seen as a reflection of the amazing work they do. I am astounded by people who work in childcare. I think it is such a difficult job, and we acknowledge the important role that they do, and we'll do everything we can to make sure they are included in the Royal Commission.
At the moment, as I understand it, the 3-year-olds who are able to access preschool in South Australian settings, talking about children under guardianship, Aboriginal children, are the 2 cohorts that have for some time been able to access. I should say, when I talk about 3-year-olds, I'm talking about the cohort of children who are able to access 2 years of preschool. I think we can use 3 and 4 as shortcuts for that. Those 3-year-olds are pretty much doing the same program as the 4-year-olds. There's not a differentiated set of development and learning as a whole for the 3-year-olds as opposed to the 4-year-olds. Is the government doing any work to prepare the sort of program that would be of most benefit to the 3-year-old children themselves if it was a universal program, or is it the expectation they'd undertake the same program as the 4-year-olds?
So I think I'll start with some comments and hand over to Ms Bray to add some more, and I'd like to acknowledge the work that has already been done in terms of trying to provide preschool wherever possible for 3-year-olds who are in those vulnerable cohorts, understanding the importance of doing that and the really positive effect it can have on their lives and their families' lives as well, because of course we need to remember that it's not just about the child, it's about the family, because often it's people at, or staff at our schools, our preschools or our childcare centres who are the ones who get to see first if there is some kind of dysfunction in the family or something is going wrong, and can hopefully then trigger other interventions and support to wrap around that family. So I acknowledge the great work that's been done in terms of trying to get 3-year-olds in those vulnerable cohorts into some kind of 3-year-old preschool. And I met recently with Good Start Early Learning to, I guess, just to properly introduce myself now that I'm the Minister and talk to them about their priorities for the sector, and they passed on to me the work that they are doing as well in terms of trying to provide that kind of, even in a childcare setting, more like preschool services for young people, and I acknowledge the work they're doing. But I might allow Ms Bray to add some more comments to my answer.
Thank you. And through the Chair, I see historically we obviously have the early learning strategy, which was a quality strategic work plan that outlined the department on delivering a range of different reform in preschool and child development space. And part of that particular piece of reform is certainly looking at how we look at the early learning space and how we look at the tangible things in the preschool and the pedagogy for preschool children. And it's a space really nationally that is being looked into, the play-based 3-year-old preschool programme, and how we can ensure that it does differ from having 2 years of 3-year-old and 4-year-old preschool.
Thank you. That's helpful. So, given that work is already underway at a national level, and there's an understanding that the 3-year-olds, many of whom are already in the system and have been for years, are there any professional development programs the government's planning to put in place to support staff so that they can best support the unique needs and abilities of 3-year-olds, especially given that there are so many more set to join their 4-year-old friends in the coming years if the government's policy is enacted?
So I might make some preliminary remarks in regards to the National Children's Education and Care Workforce Strategy, which I dare say might be something the member for Morialta is already aware of. All governments have committed to that strategy, and it recognises the critical importance of the early childhood education and care sector, as well as the dedication and resilience of its workforce. And I know I said it in my opening remarks in the earlier session that we have all witnessed throughout the COVID-19 pandemic the incredible work that they've done. And the 10-year strategy from 2022 to 2031 recognises the complexity of the workforce challenges in the sector, and that all stakeholders collectively have a role to play in supporting the recruitment, retention, sustainability and quality of the workforce. High-quality children's education and care sets the foundations for lifelong learning and development, and a vital factor in the delivery of high-quality education and care, of course, is an ongoing, experienced and well-qualified workforce. I might pass over to Ms Braydack to provide a bit more detail about that strategy and how it addresses the question the member for Morialta asked.
Thank you. And through the Chair, there's a number of things that are outlined in that workforce strategy, including the professional standing of the industry, also as well how we attract people to the particular sector and retain them. And there's a significant part there around leadership, and fundamental to your question around training and looking at vocational and educational opportunities for those trainers. I will say as well that the Department have heavily invested and supported training around our early childhood workers, and only a couple of weeks ago I attended a forum where we had all of the directors, early childhood directors, in the room in regard to the requirements around the training and the requirements around their ongoing support.
Can I ask, in relation to the commitment to deliver 3-year-old preschool for all children in South Australia, has there been any advice or briefings to the Minister on what the recurrent cost of delivering that commitment is once there is universal access for 3-year-old preschool?
Thank the member for the question. Obviously, it is a pretty complex area, which is the reason in the first place that we announced that we'd have a Royal Commission to provide advice on how we deliver on our commitment, which we are completely committed to and have not resolved from not one bit. And obviously, I would point out too that we can talk costs, but really all the data and the position that we come from here is that this is a really significant investment in our young people. So, I mean, what we have said, and I acknowledge that there was work that was done in the past, to which I think the member for Morialta has referred previously. I think it occurred under the former Labor government, possibly when Jay Weatherall was still Premier, which looked at the model, because that's when I guess the public dialogue really started to kick off around a move to this. I acknowledge that is there, but it is now somewhat out of date and presumes a model as well. And what we are looking at to get advice from the Royal Commission is exactly the mode of delivery. And there are potentially different ways of doing that will all meet the commitment that we made before the election, and we will await the advice of the Royal Commission on that, and no doubt further there'll be further information to come as the Royal Commission does its work and we finally get recommendations and then can move into the delivery phase.
Is the Minister able to identify then whether the commitment to deliver universal access for 3-year-old preschool is going to allow 15 hours of access for every child in South Australia to a preschool program once the commitment is fully delivered? 15 hours per week?
I thank the member for the question. I think it's safe to say that is our ambition, of course, 15 hours, as is the case with 4-year-old preschool. It will depend on what the take-up of the 15 hours is. That could be different because we are talking about a younger cohort, and although a year might not sound like much at that age, a year is quite a bit. But I'm sure, as the member is aware, we have a when I say long-standing, thankfully it is now a longer agreement for universal access to 15 hours of preschool for 4-year-olds, and I acknowledge it's good that is now not the year-to-year proposition than it has been in the past. But of course, we want to work with the new federal government, who I think share our ambitions in terms of 3-year-old preschool, on what an agreement might look like for 3-year-old preschool as well. I think some conversations have already started. I certainly, once I get the chance to meet with the new Ministers for Education and Early Childhood, which I hope will happen soon, I'll be putting on their agendas fairly and squarely that we will be seeking federal government support as well, of course, which will come as no surprise to anyone. So I guess there'll be more to come from those negotiations with the federal government in terms of what an agreement might look like, but I'd be pretty confident in saying that other jurisdictions in Australia who are moving this way, which includes Victoria, ACT, potentially New South Wales, would be looking for a similar kind of co-investment from the federal government in this investment in this important area.
So to clarify, the government's ambition is for it to be 15 hours, but it could be a different number. It could be 12 hours or some other number. And the cost or the investment when the program is fully delivered, the state government will be seeking some federal contribution towards that, noting that for 4-year-olds, for example, I think the state covers 12 hours and the federal government covers a further 3 hours. So if I've got that right, can I just ask one other question in relation
I might
to...
just, just if I could, Member for Morialta, I think my answer was our ambition is 15, as is the case with 4-year-old preschool. I think what I said is we won't be sure in terms of the uptake from 3-year-olds, in terms of families opting to
So the offering
utilise.
you're expecting to be 15, you're not certain whether all of them will use all 15?
That's correct.
Certainly. All right, so that's the ambition of the government and the cost you'll be seeking to identify through the Royal Commission and gain some money from the Commonwealth in delivering it. In terms of what the government's expectation of what the delivery of their commitment will look like, I acknowledge that the Minister acknowledged that not all preschool in South Australia is delivered by public preschools and kindergartens. There are a number of accredited preschool type programs in long daycare services. Good Start, I think, offers a number, and there may be other services that provide a preschool type program, non-government schools, for example. Is it the government's expectation that the delivery of universal access for 3-year-old preschool will at least take place in an accredited, approved preschool type program, or is there flexibility that the Minister seeks for the Royal Commission to come up with an alternative proposal?
Thank the member for the question. I guess what I would say as my answer is that is a fantastic example of the kind of complexity in the area that led to us deciding a Royal Commission to offer a roadmap. That's a very good example of the complexity in terms of how preschool is currently offered in South Australia, and some key differences in how it is offered here compared to how it is offered, for instance, in Victoria, which is in some cases quite different. And that's why we decided that instead of racing ahead and saying we're doing it and we're not going to seek the advice of a Royal Commission on this big change, we're going to blindly do it without that advice. That's why we have been firm to say we will seek the expert advice of a Royal Commission first to make sure that all those kind of things, like the member for Morialta correctly identified just there, and that's possibly just the tip of the iceberg, are considered properly to make sure that the model we put in place, which will meet our election commitment, is the right model.
I'll just go to the member Gibson. She's been waiting patiently for my call.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I refer you to Budget Paper 4, Volume 1, page 182, target 2022-23 at the second to last dot point. Can the Minister update the committee about the pilot programs being established to increase the number of South Australian children receiving an early childhood development check?
Thank the member for Gibson for the excellent question. And child development screening is a critical tool to check that children's development stays on track. As I said in an answer to an earlier question, 90% of a child's brain development occurs before they are 5, which essentially means there's no hope for any of us in this room. We are stuck with largely being the people that we are. But it is incredible to think that so much of it occurs by the age of 5 and highlights why it's so important that we get those early years right, and it highlights why investment in those early years is an investment and should be viewed as such and not as a cost. Child development checks allow us to pick up developmental delays early before they're entrenched, and we know how hard it is to ameliorate those once they're entrenched. Certainly around issues of literacy and numeracy, having a father, as I said earlier, who was a high school English and Australian history teacher, would always say that those kids that he got into the classroom in Year 7, who I guess had not had the success in their early years in terms of becoming literate that others had, it was a very, very hard task to arrest that, much harder than it is at the earlier years when those issues are identified by things like these childhood development checks. And the government is expanding the reach of child development checks across South Australia through a range of pilots with government and non-government partners. Negotiations are currently being finalised for the first 2 pilots, which are expected to commence in July of this year. These pilots will be with Playgroups South Australia and with the Caring Futures Institute at Flinders University in collaboration with Good Start Early Learning. I'm advised that we expect that the pilot with the Caring Futures Institute will offer health and development checks to over 2,000 children at 20 Good Start Early Learning sites. And I mentioned earlier that I had met with Good Start Early Learning recently. We discussed 3-year-old preschool, but they were also very, very keen to talk to me about how they are doing these pilots with over 2,000 children at their sites, and I think I gave them an undertaking or expressed an interest in going along and actually sort of perhaps seeing how they do it, given the importance of it. The pilot will include selected sites in regional areas, including Mount Gambier and Whyalla. Nurse practitioners and registered nurses will conduct the checks on site. Checks will only be conducted with parent consent, of course, and parents will be informed of the outcome and referred to services where that is necessary. Allied health support will be offered to families at Flinders University or through local services. While details are yet to be finalised, we expect that the pilot with Playgroup South Australia will test a different service model. Screenings will be undertaken by a trained professional using a validated screening tool, but will not be performed by a registered nurse, and they won't include a health check. All families attending playgroups that are registered with Playgroup SA will be offered the chance to have a child developmental check. Families will be present during the check. We can all understand why that would be necessary, as it has been with our vaccinations. And families will be offered pathways for assistance if that is required. Families will be encouraged to see their healthcare provider if any health concerns are identified in these checks. Beyond these 2 pilots, we are looking at additional pilots and other ways to increase the reach of child developmental checks. Over the coming 12 months, different service models will be trialled and piloted in different locations. All of the pilots will be independently evaluated to understand if they increase the reach of child developmental screening. The remaining pilots will be rolled out progressively over the next 2 years. Longer term, the pilots will inform our development of a system-wide approach to expanding the reach of child development checks. The total budget for the program in 22-23 is $8.3 million. This is going to increase to $16.7 million in 24-25. This will include surveys of parents to find out if the models work for them, and I'm sure we can all understand about why that is important and why it's always important that we get parent engagement in things like this. Learnings from all pilots will inform system-wide rollout in the coming years, and I thank the member for her interest in this very important area, and I look forward to be able to sharing more information about how these pilots go in the coming months.
For Moriarty.
Thank you, and I thank the Minister for that answer. We were talking earlier about hard-fought-for new money for the department, and I'm pleased to hear that it's still there.
I acknowledge the former minister's role in that too.
It's one of my better days. Can I ask, in relation to the early childhood strategy that the Minister was just talking about, a couple of the points in that strategy, and they're on page 23 if the Minister needs to check later, were in relation to looking at potential policy settings for an additional year of preschool for both children in remote and rural programs, and particularly the department was looking at preschools that with the numbers of 4-year-olds were not potentially at the mark where they needed to be under the department's funding scheme, whether there was some opportunity to include 3-year-olds in those programs in remote centres. And secondly, the explicit a suggestion of reviewing policy settings for an additional year of preschool for developmentally delayed children. And the department was looking at these two areas for potential inclusion of 3-year-olds in preschool programs in addition to the guardianship and Aboriginal children last year. Are those investigations still underway?
Thank you, Member, for the question. I'll give some preliminary remarks and then I might hand over to Ms Atkinson to provide a bit more detail on this. So I understand the initial investment in the early learning strategy to which the member for Morialta refers is $50.1 million over the first 4 years, and that includes more than $35 million allocated to expand the child development screening system. Through the early learning strategy, we've partnered with a range of key non-government organisations to raise the profile and the focus of the early years. These include the ongoing work with Playgroup SA, including the allocation of $200,000 for Playgroup SA in June of last year, and Raising Literacy Australia, including a $500,000 grant funding allocated in June of last year also. Ongoing local government collaboration, including a successful council grant allocation round of $200,000, was completed in April of this year. I'm advised that implementation of the strategy is underway with 100% of the current actions on track or completed, and even despite the interruptions which we all know took place due to COVID-19. I might pass over to Ms Atkinson now to talk, if she can, in a bit more specificity about your question.
Thank you. With regards to the additional year for developmentally delayed children, that's now being incorporated into the implementation of mid-year intake for preschool. The mid-year intake allowing parents to choose at what period of time their children are most ready to start preschool, but also allows the ability, if they've started in the mid-year, to potentially do an additional 2 terms of preschool if considered needed before they commence school.
So can I clarify that rather than talking about 3- and 4-year-olds in that circumstance, we'd then be talking about 4- and 5-year-olds in preschool getting their 2 years?
That's right, the additional year after the current universal entitlement as opposed to before.
And has there been any further policy work done on whether the opportunity for 3-year-olds in remote communities may be able to benefit from preschool sooner than the delivery of the 2026 election commitment?
Yes, but I acknowledge the importance of doing that, and that time is of the essence for all kids of that age, but particularly in the really vulnerable cohorts, as so many of our young people are who live on the lands. We're
continuing to work with individual communities where there is capacity within their existing preschool programs, particularly in regional areas where there might not be other early learning opportunities, to incorporate them into the existing 4-year-old programs within the staffing entitlement, while a broader program of work is being developed to look at what sort of entitlement could be rolled out more broadly, noting, of course, the commitment to deliver 3-year-old preschool from 2026 impacts that.
In the House and on the radio, the Minister and I have had some conversations about what exactly the Minister's election commitment of universal 3-year-old preschool commencing in 2026 arrived. I don't want to traverse over all of those discussions, that's why I've left it into the last 4 minutes of this session to raise this issue. Can I ask the Minister, in what year will all South Australian 3-year-old children have the entitlement to access preschool type programs?
Repeating what I've said and sounding overly obstructionist, which I don't want to be, I would say that is why we have funded a Royal Commission, and as I think a number of us here have said in our answers to other questions broadly on this topic in this session, there is more than one mode of delivery here that will still achieve our election commitment, and rather than from opposition blindly pluck one of those pathways and then be stuck with it, we did what I still firmly believe was the prudent and sensible thing to do, and to have a Royal Commission to provide us with expert advice on which pathway to take, but noting that in no way should my answer be taken to be walking away or stepping back from what we committed. It is completely in line with what we said on the very first press conference that we did about this announcement on, I think, October the 21st or 23rd of last year. As I said, we will have a Royal Commissioner soon, I hope. The process can begin. We're confident at the very least meeting the timeframes that we set out publicly before the state election, if not compressing those and meeting them earlier, to make sure that we meet the timeline that we set ourselves of 2026. There are a host of things that the Royal Commission is going to need to consider. They involve, but not exhaustively, things like existing capacity in the system, where more capacity would need to be provided, workforce considerations, and the member for Badco very late last night, and I referred earlier to how she's always in touch with me about issues in this manner, sent me an email. I was up reading briefs, of course, for estimates, but it was an ad she had seen from the Victorian government advertising workforce opportunities for their preschool, which I think slipped across the border on Channel 10, probably because we get a bit of, that station gets a little bit more content from there. But they are making a concerted effort, I should say, to try to attract staff from outside their jurisdiction, including from wonderful South Australia, to meet the timelines they have set themselves. And I, for one, as the Minister, do not want to be in a position where we are losing existing staff. So all those things, I guess, need to be considered, including making sure that we have the workforce.
Irrespective of the method of delivery, and I understand that there are different options available, and irrespective of whether it's 15 hours or 12 hours, whether it's in a public preschool or a long daycare centre with a preschool type program, irrespective of all of those things, one of the things that I think is well understood is that whether it's a 4-year-old in long daycare or a 4-year-old in preschool, 3-year-old in long daycare or a 3-year-old in preschool, the long daycare service is funded by parents and or the Commonwealth with subsidies. The preschool service is predominantly funded by the state government and is very cost effective, therefore, for parents. So if a parent is interested in when their 3-year-old is able to attract this improved financial benefit to them, is that going to be available to all parents in 2026 or is it not?
A good question. My answer ultimately will be, again, a consideration from the Royal Commission, but I acknowledge that you've touched on a really important point, which I probably haven't laboured as I should have in my answers, which is that there aren't just the considerations around the well-being of the children and the families. There are also considerations around what will be a pretty significant cost of living saving, given the way that we fund and deliver 4-year-old preschool here, and the cost to families for long daycare or any other form of care. So again, it's one of the key tenets of what the Royal Commission will need to look at, but I acknowledge that families will be interested in accessing 3-year-old preschool for reasons over and above the well-being of their child, and that includes cost savings that they will reap from that.
And that cost isn't met in the budget?
Ooh.
Consider it a comment, if you like.
A comment, okay. The allotted time having expired, I declare the examination of early childhood development complete. I thank the Minister and committee members and staff, my advisors, for their time. Now we go to administered items. Minister, do you have new staff, new advisors?
There will be some changes, Chair, yes.
Okay.
We'll move as quickly as we can.
I just advise the committee that the member for Gibson has been replaced with the member for Elizabeth.
New faces.
Go ahead, please.
If I may.
Yes.
Again, joined by Professor Martin Wessel, the Chief Executive, also joined by Dr Peter Smith, who's the Executive Director of Strategic Policy and External Relations. In the nosebleed section down the back, we have Greg Mackey, the Chief Executive of the History Trust, and Michaela Bensley, who's the Interim Chief Executive of the SACE Board. Again, I don't intend on making any opening statements. Happy to take questions.
Okay. Member for Moriarty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. If in doubt, we'll go to volume 1 of the budget paper 4, page 178, where the list of administered items is, and there's maybe some specific ones, but can I clarify, does the Minister for Education retain responsibility for the History Trust, Carclew, Windmill Theatre and Patch Theatre, or are some of those likely to become the responsibility of the Minister for the Arts?
Thank the member for the question, and I am happily retaining those as Minister for Education.
Outstanding.
Yes, indeed. Agreed.
On page 206, there appears to be some dramatic movement in the relation to the arts entities under grants and intra-government transfers. Can the Minister explain that fairly substantial change in the funding between the 21-22 estimated result and the 22-23 budget? If you go to the bottom half of the page where arts entities are listed, they're listed twice, and there are some fairly dramatic changes both between 21-22 budget and the estimated result and this year's budget in relation to those.
Thank the member for the question.
Well, maybe I can refine the question. Are any of the arts entities, the 4 listed, expected to be making contributions towards the whole of government savings task, understanding that the Education Department has been ring-fenced from that savings task by and large? Are these arts entities included in that ring-fencing, or are they going to have a contribution to make towards those savings?
And could I cheekily add that that's one of the hard-fought victories to which we have both referred.
Well done.
I'd invite Mr Bernardi to come and give. This has got a Mr Bernardi question written all over it, I think.
So the settings that have been in place under the former government are still in existence.
Excellent. Can I, shall we move to the SACE board at this point?
I might invite Ms Bensley to come up for this one. Thank you, Dr Smith.
And I thank Ms Bensley for the briefing I had last week. It was appreciative and will hopefully mean that we can get through these in a pacier fashion than might otherwise have been the case. Can I ask the Minister, though, when will the government appoint a chair and a permanent chief executive to the SACE board?
Was the question when, member?
Yes, when?
The short answer for me, and I might pass over to Ms Bensley for a bit more detail, is about 6 weeks, I am told, is the timeline that's been set for me as Minister to finalise those appointments. But I might ask Ms Bensley if you'd like to give you a little bit more detail of why that's the time frame.
Yep. So
The expressions of interest for the vacancy of the board will go into the various publications, I think, next weekend. I think they close in about the third week of July, and then a list is provided to the Minister's office for conversations and then selection around that vacancy, and then the chair of the board needs to be selected as well. With regard to the recruitment of the Chief Executive, the board has recently met and stood up a committee that relates to the selection and recruitment, and that process is in train, focusing on the selection of a recruitment agency to support that, that appointment.
When is it anticipated that process will conclude then?
Between 4 to 6 months, I would imagine, depending on the candidate.
Okay, and we thank you for your service in the interim and potentially further. I wouldn't want to comment. Can the Minister update the House about the redevelopment of the personal learning plan and the research project?
Thank the member for the question. The SACE Board Strategic Plan 2020-2023, obviously a very important part of the vision that the board has set for the organisation. The 2020-23 strategic plan, developed under the direction of the board, has a 3-year time frame that incorporates the SACE Stage 2 review recommendations. It's focused on the achievement of 3 major priorities: bold leader, connected qualification and thriving learner, that underpin the SACE Board's purpose of shaping education so that students can thrive. The main areas that will lead educational change and student transformation to thrive includes developing a learner profile as a way of representing a wider range of students' learning and development. This is certainly something that I'm very keen to support and hear more about, because such a profile would include a student's subject grades and a representation of their capabilities also outside the strict parameters of their grades. I might add an aside here that certainly something that I saw in my schooling years was probably a failure from the education system broadly to acknowledge skills that clever young people had, which were outside the traditional scope of what was deemed to be intelligence or clever, which ultimately resulted in them being disengaged from school because they felt that they were stupid or not up to it, or of no value in the classroom, or not having a future in our education system, which was both an incorrect assessment of their skills and a poor outcome for them. Embed a capabilities model into the SACE that will support teachers to help students develop their capabilities, capture evidence of their development against a standard, quality assure teachers' judgment, and then certify and represent the capabilities. Renew the Stage 2 research project with clearly defined options, the first of which is an entrepreneurial project. A pilot program is underway now with a second larger pilot scheduled for 2023. Renew the personal learning plan, which I think was another component of the member's question. A pilot program is underway for that also now, with a second larger pilot also scheduled for 2023 in line with the entrepreneurial project for Stage 2 of the research project. Renew the VET recognition register, working closely with the Training and Skills Commission and Industry Skills Councils, supporting the flexible industry pathways, which we spoke about earlier, outlined in the VET for School Students policy. I might leave my comments there because I think this is one where Ms Bensley might like to make some additional comments.
Sure. I think importantly, both of the revitalised personal learning plan and research project are being developed with teachers in a pilot mode. We're testing, we're learning, and then we're adapting with both of those. In terms of the draft kind of names, in terms of how we're describing them, with the personal learning plan, we're looking at exploring identity in futures, and with the revitalised research project, we're activating identity in futures. The names of those are purposeful in terms of not only being the bookends of the SACE, but articulation through those subjects. With the personal learning plan, the shift is from primarily a focus on a career, which is sort of like what do you want to be, to who do you want to be. So a focus more around the sorts of skills and abilities that you need to be able to progress into the world. With the research project, primarily the focus in terms of the shift is from
fairly heavily scaffolded evidence of learning with a really tight focus on research methodologies to a greater focus on student agency and their own ownership in choosing their own strategy to adapt and learn so that they can plan and create their own learning area in an area that they're really excited by. Both the Revitalise Research Project will allow that contextual ability for students to have a vocational pathway, as well as a focus on the entrepreneurial perspectives there as well. In the pilot phases, the students are actually being resulted in these subjects and it being recognised obviously towards SACE completion as well as entry and inclusion into the ATAR. And we're going for a much broader pilot in 2023.
Is the SACE board working with universities on alternative mechanisms for school leavers to gain university entry as an alternative to the ATAR?
Yes, we most definitely are. So it's our intention that developing the whole person is an intentional outcome of senior secondary education. Of course, it's important to know skills and knowledge, but it's equally as important to be able to demonstrate how you might be self-motivated in your learning, whether you're principled in terms of the way that you might go about your scientific studies, how you work and communicate with others. This demand to have a better understanding around what that whole person brings is really demanded by employers and industry and universities going forward. So we're in the beginning phases of trying to understand data models, working with the 3 universities around what it might look like to create a whole picture of a student so that they can better match the pathways with the sort of student that they're after. And that would be a combination of the assessment of their capabilities and their grades in terms of subject disciplines, and that would be evidenced in what we're calling the learner profile.
Can I ask, what would that mechanism or would the learner profile mean for a student who wanted to access a teaching degree, given the government's commitment to work with the universities to install a floor ATAR of 70 for those degrees?
So certainly we are expecting the learner profile to sit alongside the ATAR. So access to universities and those pathways in the traditional method using the ATAR and a range of other methods is still available. This is more a focus on those students who wouldn't otherwise be able to get into university from their ATAR, to be able to demonstrate that they have a range of capabilities that are as valued in terms of their pathways going forward.
So for that student in question, if their ATAR is 69 but their learner profile suggests in every other aspect they're doing great, they'll still be underneath that floor of the ATAR because the ATAR will still be there.
This is absolutely still a work in progress in how it sits alongside. We're still in the very preliminary phases of actually working with teachers around how they make fair and valid assessments around capabilities, and then how that gets evidence within that data model is certainly a work in progress.
And I might add, if I could, Member for Morialta, that the Minister in Cabinet who has carriage of the commitment around the floor ATAR of 70 is the Minister for Higher Education.
Yes, okay.
I'm happy to answer whatever questions I can. But
happily, I have some time with the Deputy Premier tomorrow afternoon, so we can pursue that then. Can I ask, is the government planning on providing any further funding to the SACE board for furthering the work on the learner profile in the coming years?
To be perfectly frank with you, Member for Morialta, it is not something that I have considered yet, but I guess you could take my earlier remarks about how interested I am in this, and I know you are too, which is a great thing. Have a bit of bipartisanship on the need for us to head in this direction. I'd certainly be open to that, but it'll be subject to the usual budget processes, I guess. But I think there is an enormous value in this. I also think it really aligns with other things this government is doing in a range of areas. I also I've had a whisper in my ear that they have not yet asked for anything, which so you've now given them that idea, so thanks very much.
You're welcome. I might move to other matters if the Minister wants some assistance in relation to chaplaincy funding. The agreement with Commonwealth regarding chaplaincy funding comes to a close at the end of this year. Has the Minister had any discussions with the new Commonwealth Minister about the renewal of that agreement, and is it expected that South Australia will receive the same amount as previously from the Commonwealth to deliver this service? Will it be adjusted for inflation, for example?
Thank you, Member for Morialta, for this question. Can I say from the outset, the first I was aware of the announcement was when I read it in the newspaper, I think it was. Not that I'm not saying I don't welcome it, but I have not been involved in the federal government's thinking or planning on this. So I am seeking more information on that myself. It's one of the things that I have on my agenda to speak to the new Federal Education Minister, Jason Clare, about. I'm hoping, maybe somewhat naively, I don't know, that it might result in additional money into our state for counselling, whether that is the kind of counselling offered by groups such as as SMG, who I have a lot of respect for, I might add. They do some very impressive work in public schools in my seat and around the area, and I'll be honest and say that I probably approached faith-based counselling in our public education system with a degree of scepticism until I sat down with principals of public primary schools in my area who may have ordinarily come at such an issue from the same angle as me, who were glowing about the work that they did and the resources that it provides them. So my hope is that the announcement from the federal government, whilst I don't have any more detail on it, I'm hoping it might result in a situation where we can provide more of this type of really important counselling, keeping in mind that our $50 million for mental health and wellbeing will do some of the heavy lifting in this area as well, but that it might result in us having more counselling offered across our system, whether that is from chaplains through groups like the Schools Ministry Group or Centre Care or Uniting Country SA or Your Dream Incorporated, or whether it is the secular counselling that the Federal Minister Jason Clare has been talking about. I'll certainly be seeking information around what their intentions are in terms of what South Australia's share will be, and I hope it results in an outcome where more kids have access to the counselling they need.
Thank you for that, and obviously we're very eager for the Commonwealth to provide South Australia with as many resources as possible. Notwithstanding that, the last time this agreement was done, the funding was maintained, but the cost of delivering the services had increased and the demand for the services had increased, and so the former government put in place, for the first time I understand, some state government funding to supplement that federal government funding towards chaplaincy. So is that funding still in the Education Department's budget of what we expect to spend next year, and is the government committed to, if needed, continuing to use state government funds to ensure that no existing schools that receive chaplaincy support miss out?
I'm happy to have a little chat to Mr Bernardi and Mr Westphal, but I'm not going to preempt the negotiations I have with the federal government, because, like I'm saying, I hope that South Australia is a winner in terms of that money that has been put on the table, but I don't have an answer for that yet. If your question was in terms of the $1.05 million put in place by the previous government in terms of additional funding for the period from 2020 to 2022, we are committed to that commitment, if I could put it that way. We're not making any changes there. And I guess we'll work really closely with the new federal government as soon as we can to get a more accurate idea of what their funding commitment might mean for us, and then have to, after that, analyse what unmet need exists.
But you're maintaining an open mind should the federal component not be sufficient to meet current need, including the current state component?
Keeping in mind that we have also committed the $50 million for 100 extra wellbeing support officers, but of course if schools come to me as the Minister and say there is a gap in terms of what we all know is incredibly important counselling service, then I'll of course consider that.
Thank you. I'll move to non-government school programs. There's a 50% increase, $500,000 extra per year that the Minister committed to, the former government committed to in relation to funding in the Catholic school sector for buses. The former government committed to a 50% increase for Catholic and independent schools, but the budget appears to only deliver the 50% increase for the Catholic school sector. Is that an oversight? Is that something that's going to be addressed? Or is that the intention of the government to shift from the traditional funding of the Catholic sector and the independent sector equally in such provision?
thanks to the member for Morialta for the question, and perhaps I just give a little bit of perspective on how we came to that point. So before the election, obviously we're both of us, you as Minister and me as the Shadow Minister, were approached by independent schools and Catholic sectors about what support they were seeking from whoever the next state government was going to be. My recollection is the Catholic sector strongly put forward a request for more money towards the school bus issue, which, as we both know, has been a problem for many years. My recollection is that AISA, or the association, didn't raise that, but having said that, we've had negotiations since. I've met with Ms Granskins and Mr McGorran to discuss what Ms Granskins explained was possibly a miscommunication from both of us in terms of what the independent schools were also looking for. It wasn't our intention to treat them in an inequitable fashion or anything like that. The amounts we gave were the same in terms of $2 million across the forward estimates for the Catholic sector for buses, and the same towards the two independent special schools, one of which I think is in the member for Bad Coast seat, which we have been to, and the other is Sun Eden Special School, which I'm very keen to get to because the work they do there is quite remarkable. But we've had conversations recently with Ms Granskins that she had assumed, because of how funding had been dealt with in the past, that the commitment around buses would be for both. I've given my undertaking to Ms Granskins and Mr McGorran, both in writing and verbally, that I intend to work with AISA to see what we can do to try to meet their needs in terms of buses. I'm hopeful. We've started those negotiations and work, and I am hopeful that we can land something there. But I guess I want to say that our intention was not to try to move away from the way we have dealt and supported each of those non-government sectors. We felt we were just responding to the specific requests that were put to us in opposition, but confident we'll find a way through this that will be agreeable to all parties.
I appreciate the Minister's frankness there. I suggest the Catholic sector, I'm certain, would welcome an extra $500,000 to support their students with disability as well. Can I ask, is the government committed to continuing the non-government school no-interest loans program? And if so, when is the next grant funding round going to be open?
The short answer is yes. And I did appreciate, I must say, I would have liked it if the former minister had always told me when he was coming to my seat, but I understand that's not how these things work. But I did appreciate his, I mean that in jest completely. I do appreciate the letters he used to give about successful projects under the loan scheme and grant scheme that were given to schools in the area, because you would ordinarily always find out about that. And I know how well received they have been by those schools, and there are at least two, I think, in my seat that were beneficiaries. I'm thinking King's Baptist and maybe St Francis Xavier Regional Catholic College. We are committed to continuing it. I'll see if we have a bit of information. Very good. Dr Smith tells me round 3 is due to open in June 2022. Obviously that's now, and closed in August 2022.
Timely.
Good timing, good question. Thank you. Round 4 is scheduled to open in November 2022 for all the members of Parliament on both sides.
Well, I'm sure there are hundreds and hundreds of school finance officers watching this broadcast right now.
Of course.
Can I ask how much funding remains available in the SAFA fund under which these loans have been established?
I'm advised that loan amounts between $500,000 and $10 million per schools are available. I don't think we propose any changes to that. SAFA has advised that there's been $112.03 million approved under the scheme to date, $207.97 million remaining in the scheme, excluding 3 applications from round 2, worth a combined total of almost $22 million that are pending approval. Total loan amount approved for round 1 was $65.35 million. Round 2 opened for applications 16 September 2021, closed on 7 November 21. 11 applications receiving just shy of $91 million. And of these, 8 applications totalling $46.68 million were approved.
Page 206, there's a line for multicultural grants. I'm making an assumption that this is funding that goes towards the Community Language Schools Association. And if that be the case, I note that in the DPC, in Multicultural Affairs, there's a further $1 million a year that's to go to those community language schools. Can you advise, firstly, there appears to be a very small reduction from last year to this year in that multicultural grants line from 2.19 to 2.14 million. Is that as a result of an efficiency somewhere, or is that something, or a program ending? And secondly, is the Community Language Schools Association going to have separate funding arrangements with Multicultural Affairs and DPC and Education, or is it expected that that funding will actually transfer from Multicultural Affairs to Education so that the Community Language Schools can just have one partner in this arrangement?
I'm told, in relation to your last question, it'll be one partner. So just a tiny bit of background before I might hand over to Dr. Smith, who I think is a bit more expert on this than me. So the current, I think, the current arrangement in 2022-23, 2.4 million is available to support community language school program. The program supports more than 1,350 teachers and volunteers in 95 accredited schools. They deliver 47 languages to around 9,000 students. In the 2021 school year, 22 community language schools offered a SACE program with 165 students participating. And I might pass over to Dr. Smith to maybe give a bit more information about how we plan on that program.
Thank you, Minister, through the Chair. So we'll obviously be working with the Community Language Association to design an appropriate application of that funding, and we'll be preparing advice to the Minister in short order. The election commitment is currently being transferred to the Minister for Education, so we're waiting for that to occur before we commence detailed consultation.
Thank you. And I'll take one more question. It's on the History Trust, but
You take one more question, or you'll ask one more question?
I'll ask one. I'll take your offer.
Oh, okay.
To ask one more question.
Can I add something very quick?
Oh, yes, sir.
Answer, because I understand the questions were asked of the Minister for Multicultural Affairs in her estimate session, and I think the answer that the Minister gave was that was in terms of, I think, your latter question, in terms of who is responsible for the grants, that work is still being done on that. So I'm happy to take it on notice and come back to you rather than give you an incorrect answer, and happy to take another question.
That's all right. Thank you. In relation to the History Trust, what is the timeline on the History Trust needing to move out of accommodation, and where will it be going? I understand that the Torrens Parade Ground has a new tenant, effectively, that has got a very hard deadline.
Thank the member for the question. I've had some very positive interactions so far with the History Trust, one of which, of course, the member joined me at, which was, I have to say, a lot of fun, which can't always be said about the events that we go to. And I thank the Chief Executive, who's down the back there somewhere, for making sure that I think the libations, as he referred to, were flowing on the evening. So there's...
All donated, I understand.
Indeed. So yes, there is a timeline for the History Trust to move from Torrens Parade Ground, because I think it is Legacy, if I recall, who are moving in there under plans to co-locate services around veterans onto that very appropriate location. So we are in the process of finding alternative accommodation, which I hope will meet the needs of the History Trust in terms of what they offer, but I guess in terms of the nature of their work and where they have been located previously.
Find some buildings in Gawler.
I'm sure the Chair would like that.
The historic town of Gawler.
I believe the timeline for the History Trust to be out of Torrens Parade Ground is end of October this year, so we are working feverishly at the moment to accommodate that. There is still money committed in the budget